Hello, everyone. This is Jeff Halper again from ICAD, speaking to you from Jerusalem. This is our December last month 2025 update on what's happening in our region, with all kinds of ideas of where we might be going. Right now, in terms of the update politically, right now we're in a political lull between pacification and the end game, which is normalization. Uh, but it's a lull in which a lot of things are actually happening. The process of normalization, and what I've said in all my updates for the last few months at least, has been that normalization is really the greatest threat to the Palestinians, in my view, since the Nakba, because that is how Zionism wins. That is how settler colonialism wins. And so that's always kind of in my mind. There's an urgency here about where we're going because normalization is coming down the pipeline, as we've said, maybe in the next few months, certainly in the next 6 months, or whatever. And this is what we have to keep. This is I think, the time frame, the political framework that we have to keep in mind. What do I mean by the process is moving ahead quickly? Well, first of all, we have Gaza, of course. Now, Gaza really has no meaning for Israel, in a sense. Israel doesn't want to annex it. Besides Smotrich and a few others, Israel doesn't really want to settle it. Gaza has, for Israel, one overriding concern, and that is security, because Gaza has been, of course, the base of Hamas and the Islamic Jihad, the only really effective pockets of resistance to Israel that continue to remain. And so it has no interest, and I'll talk about this in a couple minutes, in annexing Gaza or settling Gaza. It does have an interest in controlling Gaza, and it has an interest, of course, in pacifying the resistance from Gaza. So Gaza still remains a major concern for Israel, but it's in the process of turning its back and walking away. And of course, the context for all of this and what's happening is the so-called peace plan for Gaza that was announced by Trump and, tellingly, Netanyahu together in the White House in September and ratified, actually to many people's dismay, including mine, ratified by the UN Security Council just last month. Why dismayed? Because it's really ratifying an additional, almost like the British mandate, an additional colonial mandate or colonial governance over Gaza, and again, excluding the Palestinians from the process. So really, what this Gaza peace plan is doing is legitimizing and making permanent Israel's settler colonialism, because it's allowing Israel to walk away from Gaza on the one side, but it's also allowing it to strengthen its control of the West Bank, its colonization of the West Bank towards normalization, and the Abraham Accords on the other, while at the same time disarming or dismantling the Palestinian struggle for liberation. Because under the ceasefire agreement, the so-called ceasefire agreement now that's in place, Hamas has returned all the hostages and the military prisoners, except for one, the body of one hostage. So in a sense, it's given up all its leverage from the point of view of any kind of negotiations on that grounds, while Israel, on the one hand, continues to hold almost 10,000 Palestinian hostages in its prisons. Many are civilians. Nobody knows who's even been arrested. There's been no charges. There's no legal process going on. And these 10,000 hostages are being held in subhuman conditions. Even the conditions they're being held in is against international law in terms of how you hold not only military, but civilian prisoners as well, and without trial. So that Israel is violating the ceasefire, both in terms of what it's keeping the Palestinian hostages in his prison, but also, of course, by attacking actively every single day beyond the so-called yellow line, which is supposed to be the ceasefire line between the Israeli forces on one side and the Palestinian held territory on the other side, that basically divides the West Bank, divides Gaza in half. And not only is Israel attacking beyond this yellow line, which is supposed to be the ceasefire line, but it's also insisting now that this yellow line is, in fact, a permanent border, not simply a temporary ceasefire line. And that also is violating the whole understanding, the whole structure of the ceasefire agreement. And so it's attacking at will. Every day, Israel is attacking civilians. Over 360 Palestinians have been killed since the ceasefire went into power in October, including 70 children. It's continuing to attack Hamas fighters. It's continuing to assassinate Hamas commanders. It's continuing its herbicide, its destruction of the infrastructure and of the buildings and the homes and the cities of Gaza. All this is continuing despite the ceasefire. So not only is the ceasefire imbalanced, or Hamas has returned the hostages and military captives, and while Israel continues to hold almost 10,000 of them, but it's also imbalanced from the point of view that Israel really has permission of the United States. And let's remember, the United States is the only force really involved in this ceasefire agreement. It's always had a monopoly over negotiations on the Palestinian issue. Europe and the rest of the world has stayed out of it. And by agreement, Israel cannot take any action in Gaza without American permission. So the fact that they're assassinating commanders, the fact that they continue the fighting, the fact that they continue the destruction, the fact that they continue to kill civilians beyond the ceasefire line simply shows, what a farce, in a way, this ceasefire agreement is. Now, the ceasefire agreement is about to go into stage 2, which is probably coming in the next couple of weeks, that only continues this process of pacification, this imbalanced pacification process that Israel is allowed to continue. By pacification, I mean the breaking of all Palestinian resistance, which is a precondition to normalization. So all of this is happening to Israel's benefit, especially the disarming of Hamas, which is a central pillar of the stage 2 of the ceasefire process. This means not only leaving the Palestinian population of Gaza and the West Bank at Israel's mercy, taking away arms, taking away their ability to resist and defend themselves, but even more so, it signals the denial by the international community, of the very right of Palestinians to armed resistance against occupation, colonization, apartheid, and genocide. Palestinians, like all other peoples, have a right to armed resistance in international law, and this disarming of Hamas is really a violation of that very right of resistance and a delegitimization of the Palestinian struggle. Israel is also violating the ceasefire agreement in that it's refusing to allow adequate humanitarian aid to come in. While 600 trucks a day are supposed to be allowed, in some days it's only 45 or so. So that even in this ceasefire, even with Israel's supposed obligation to allow humanitarian aid, starvation, disease, because there's no medical facilities that exist really, the suffering, especially in the winter. We had terrible flooding this last week in Gaza, and the suffering all continue despite the ceasefire. Now, stage 2 is also problematic, or more than problematic, in that it adds to this layer of Israeli military control that Israel means to be permanent, In other words, it wants its military control of Gaza, security control, to remain forever, no matter what any kind of ceasefire or peace agreement brings. So Israel wants to get out of Gaza. It wants to hand Gaza over to an Arab or international peacekeeping force and so on, but it still wants to keep military control. And in addition to that, there's other layers of colonial control that this ceasefire, so-called peace plan, add that remove any possibility of Palestinian self-determination. The first article in the Gaza peace plan, it's this 20-point plan that Trump and Netanyahu presented. The first article says Gaza will be a de-radicalized, terror-free zone. They're already defining what Gaza is going to be that does not pose a threat to its neighbors. Well, what do we mean by de-radicalized? It means that the very struggle for Palestinian liberation, the very concept of Palestinian liberation, is a radical idea, and it's illegitimate somehow by the terms of this Gaza so-called peace plan, and it really means submission to Israel. De-radicalization means basically the demand that Palestinians give up their struggle for liberation, which is seen simply as an illegitimate radical idea. No threat to its neighbors. Gaza being no threats to its neighbors, of course, means pacification. It means the inability of the people of Gaza, of the resistance fighters in Gaza, to resist the continued military occupation and destruction of Gaza, and by extension, the West Bank and the rest of Palestine as well. There is nothing political whatsoever about the ceasefire plan or the peace plan that even goes into stages of normalization in the future. There's nothing political about it. Nothing said about Gaza's future. Nothing is said about a Palestinian state. In other words, this isn't being put within a framework, a political framework that is somehow going to resolve the whole so-called conflict in the future. Rather, all there is a very vague commitment that maybe someday, if some kind of quiet can prevail in Gaza, maybe then there might be a pathway towards a Palestinian state. That's all it is. So all of this is really a kind of a making permanent of a sort of a combined Israeli international colonial occupation and governance of Gaza. The only thing that again, in terms of the future, which is not political, is Article 2 of the peace plan that says Gaza will be redeveloped for the benefit of the people of Gaza, whatever that means, because, making them waiters and cooks in the restaurants in Trump's Riviera in Gaza, could be for their benefit, right? Article 10 of the ceasefire agreement, the peace plan, says, in fact, explicitly, a Trump economic development plan will be put in place to rebuild and energize Gaza. So all of this is being completely taken away from the Palestinians. And again, we're going to be left with a kind of a mandate sort of colonial control of Gaza by the United States, because the instrument for governing Gaza in the near future is what's called the Gaza International Transitional Authority, a board of peace. This is in corporate terms because this is a Trump concept. This government is going to be this transitional authority, who knows how transitional it's going to be, is going to be the supreme political and legal authority over Gaza, headed by Trump as the CEO of the Board of Peace, with only symbolic Palestinian input into this. The PA, the Palestinian Authority, can only appoint a coordinator between this transitional authority and the Palestinian people and their authority itself, and can only introduce technocrats that will deal with the day-to-day governance, providing services and so on. There is no governance authority, And certainly Gaza is not being given over, even in a transitional stage, to any kind of a Palestinian authority that could someday lead to some kind of self-determination. This is an absolutely colonial, again, a colonial project that combines Israeli military control, permanent control, with a Trump-based so-called transitional authority. And the transitional authority, of course, will be enforced by an international stabilization force, as it's called. Again, not involving Palestinians. And in fact, even today in Israel, you have American military control over Gaza being implemented. You have what's called the American Civil Military Coordination Center based in Israel, which is really today governing Gaza. So all this is non-political. It's a pacification, it's colonial control, and all for Israel's benefit, allowing it again to walk away while keeping control and dismantling any kind of Palestinian resistance with no political horizon. And Article 19 stresses of this so-called peace plan stresses the non-political element of it. It says, while Gaza redevelopment advances, and when the PA reform program is faithfully carried out, the conditions may finally be in place for a credible pathway to Palestinian self-determination and statehood. You can't get more vague than that. Now, even though the peace plan says, because there was a lot of fear of this, of course, from what Trump said, that the Gaza population will not be displaced. In fact, the threat of mass displacement really remains. Israel is very actively, with U.S. support, continuing to negotiate with countries to accept masses of Palestinians, countries like South Sudan or Somaliland and so on, disregarding completely the Palestinian tie to their own country, their refusal to be displaced, and of course violating international law, which prohibits forced migration and expulsion. So that all of this in that part of it, the Gaza part of it, is again serving Israel's interests in allowing military control, but allowing it to move on to really what's more important for Israel, and that is the West Bank. So the West Bank is the second part of the update that I just want to discuss briefly, because this is really the heart of everything. Gaza is marginal in terms of Israel's interests. What's key is Judea and Samaria, as Israel calls it, the West Bank and East Jerusalem, because this is where Israel is expanding into. This is the whole idea of Judaizing Palestine. So here there are two processes going on. One, again, is pacification, breaking of all Palestinian resistance, because you can't have normalization as long as there's pacification, as long as there's resistance. I mean, normalization is normalization. It's quiet. It's normal. I feel free to walk around. The country is Israel, from the river to the sea, basically. And the minute there's a hint of resistance, of course, that breaks this idea of normalization. Wait a minute, what's going on? Why is there resistance? And Israel can't close it down and create that quiet and sense of normality that it needs in order to move on to the Abraham Accords. So it has to break Palestinian resistance, and that's what Netanyahu means when he talks about total victory. Any hint, not only defeating Hamas militarily or dismantling it politically, but down to the last fighter, you cannot have any kind of resistance, because that will destroy the illusion of normalization. And that's why in the West Bank, there's tremendous, just not only pressures. Israel is attacking the refugee camps of the West Bank that are the last remnants of resistance in the West Bank, especially the refugee camps in the north, with conventional military equipment, the same kind of herbicide destruction of homes, infrastructure, the entire camps of tens of thousands of people is happening just like it is in Gaza. In fact, Israel talks about openly the Gazification of the West Bank. And so there are 32,000 Palestinians displaced from their homes in the northern West Bank. Some estimates even go up to 70,000 people that are today displaced. You have hunger, you've got the suffering, especially now in the winter. You've got the diseases that are being spread as well. In other words, it's kind of a mini Gaza happening in the northern West Bank for the same reason: pacification, to break Palestinian resistance. And there are absolutely no constraints in Israel. Unlike Gaza, even symbolically, Israel doesn't need the permission of the United States or anyone to do anything it wants to do to the Palestinians. And therefore, we've got the Judaization process is ramping up, because normalization is not a negotiations. Normalization is imposed by the United States, by Israel, by the Arab governments, and it has nothing to do with the Palestinian people themselves. And so whatever Israel can grab up until the day the normalization agreement is signed is Israel. In this, it doesn't even have to be formalized. It doesn't have to be an agreement. Israel doesn't have to annex. It's accepted as a normal political fact by the Arab governments, by the United States, de facto, then by the rest of the world, and then it's over. So that's why, in addition to the pacification, you've got a second process, which is the Judaization of the West Bank, continuing the Judaization of all of Palestine. That's the very purpose of Zionism, is to transform an Arab country into a Jewish country, Judaization. And of course, the flip side of Judaization is de-Arabization. And so what we have today is, on the one hand, there are about 800,000 settlers today in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, living in 141 official settlements. Now, settlements minimizes what these places really are. It sounds like a couple, houses on a hillside. But if you take places like Ma'ale Adumim, Ariel, Upper Modi'in, Upper Beitar, Kiryat Arba, and so on, we're talking sometimes about settlement cities of 20, 30, 50,000 people. Some of the settlements inside East Jerusalem go up to 70,000 people. So that settlements is the wrong word. These are settlement cities, settlement blocks, and so on. And in addition, then, to these official settlements, since this new government of Netanyahu has been in place since 2023, and Bezalel Smotrich, this violent settler, is de facto, he's also the deputy minister of defense. So he is the governor of the West Bank. The people of the 2.5 people, Palestinians of the West Bank, have now been placed under the rule of a violent settler, who has then approved 224 additional settlements that are called outposts. And they're doubly illegal, because these outposts are not really approved by the Israeli government. He simply is doing it under his own authority as deputy defense minister. And of course, they're illegal by international law. So this is the grabbing of land. So huge tracts of the West Bank, what's called E1, this whole area between Ramallah and the Jordan Valley, the South Hebron Hills, like Masafer Yatta, the Jordan Valley, huge tracts of the West Bank have been grabbed and are being ethnically cleansed, of course, by violent settlers that have been unleashed by the Israeli government in the framework of Israeli army pushing people out, especially what's called Area C, and especially targeting farmers and shepherds, because they control such vast tracts of grazing and farmland. So all this ethnic cleansing is happening. Demolitions of homes are happening. This is the de-Arabization part of it as well. Um, since, and we have to remember that all this is happening within the bigger process of Zionism, of Judaizing the entire historic Palestine. So that if we're talking about demolitions, the de-Arabization process, uh, almost 500,000 Palestinian homes. And then you have to add farming structures, mosques, churches, community buildings, businesses, infrastructure have been demolished since the Nakba in 1948. About 52,000 homes and other structures were demolished in the Nakba. More than 530 entire Palestinian villages, towns, and cities, urban areas were destroyed. 60,000 more homes and community structures have been demolished in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza since 1967, since the occupation began. Thousands more inside Israel. We haven't stopped the settlement and Judaization process inside Israel, especially against the Bedouins of the Negev. And now, of course, since October 7th, 2023, 300,000 homes have been demolished in Gaza. 92% of the housing has been destroyed. So all of this then is the clearing of the table, the clearing of the land, pacification, Judaization, de-Arabization, all towards, of course, the final end game, which again is normalization. And with normalization, again, I really look at this as an end game because after normalization, there's very little political space left for Palestinians. Because normalization is normalization. There's nothing after that. There is nothing after normalization. So the Palestinians will come and say, well, what about us? We're now locked into little tiny enclaves, South Africa type Bantustan on 15% of our country, areas A, B, and whatever's left of Gaza. What about our rights of self? What about this credible path towards a Palestinian state? And the answer is going to be, well, sorry, but we've normalized. The present situation of Israel, its settlements, and a Palestinian Bantustan has been accepted by the Arab governments, the international community, the United States. It's over. We're now moving on to Sudan. We're moving on to dealing with the Ukraine, whatever. And so that's why I say this is this is the greatest threat to the Palestinians since the Nakba. Finally, what should we do? Well, there's so much to do, of course, but immediately, I think one thing that should be done is we should be launching, and here I'm going to talk about why it's difficult to do these things, but what should be done is Palestinians, anti-Zionist Israelis like myself, and all of you who are part of this massive mobilization for Palestinian rights all over the world, the most urgent campaign that we should be launching today is a campaign against normalizing Israeli apartheid. And it's funny, there's a disconnect between our support for Palestinians and the great protests that are going on, the encampments, the rallies all over the world, and all of that. But what's actually happening on the ground, because normalization is not at the center of our attention. Very seldom do people talk about it. It's very hard, I suppose, to bring hundreds of thousands of people out against normalization, which sounds very dry and gray and academic. But this is the call of the moment. If we don't stop this normalization process, it's going to be very hard to sustain the Palestinian struggle. A second thing that should be done immediately, of course, is there should be a demand of the UN, of our governments, to have a protection force in the West Bank, not only to protect Palestinians physically that are being killed and attacked and so on, but also because we have to help them remain sumud on their land as this pressure of ethnic cleansing continues to drive them off the land, together with a protection force that we should be demanding come into the West Bank through the UN. There should be more solidarity visits of all of us, all of you, to Palestine. The Palestinians on the ground obviously are feeling threatened. They're feeling isolated, right? And there's a sense of despair. This I have to say, this has always been a part of the Israeli and Zionist strategy, because the Zionists were talking about inducing despair among the Palestinians already in the 1920s. Read Zeb Jabotinsky's The Iron Wall essay, for example. So that despair is a policy of Israel in order to so preoccupy Palestinians with simply their survival, worrying about their kids. Is my house going to be standing tomorrow? And using, using the United States, the Arab governments now as allies of Zionism to pacify and to Judaize. I mean, all of this is really instilling despair among Palestinians. And what they're really asking for is solidarity visits. People should be coming from abroad. Even that kind of presence would protect them to some degree, but it would certainly give them the sense that they have the support, because people on the ground see the army, they see the settlers. They don't always see this huge international mobilization for Palestine that would give them that strength in order to continue in what are really, the most difficult times they've faced since the Nakba. And the third thing that should be done, is we should be working on a political horizon. We have to begin, and with Palestinian leadership, to begin to discuss and formulate a political program. You can't be in a political struggle without a political program. And that would be, in my view, the only political program is one democratic state. And so we should be having those kinds of discussions about a political horizon and not merely protesting at what's going on. And finally, I'll add that we also need better organization. We have to strengthen the ties, the communication, the planning, strategic work between all of you abroad, with all the organizations that you have abroad, and the Palestinians on the ground here in Palestine. There is a disconnect, I think, and I think that tie has to be strengthened. Palestinians have to be invited in or brought in more into the planning processes. I think they should have more of a voice in telling you what the agenda is, what their needs are, what the priorities are. And at the same time, you can give them that tremendous support and international lobbying that they need in order to be sumud and to continue their struggle as well. I would love to see, there used to be an international coordinating committee on Palestine 30 or 40 years ago. We should begin to think about that because, for example, as I mentioned, if we want to try to launch a campaign against normalizing Israeli apartheid, where do we go to? Well, we throw it up in the air because there is no coordinating center today for our organizations abroad, and certainly one that brings in the Palestinians from here. If Palestinians come up with a campaign or they have their priorities, maybe they have individual groups they can turn to, but there is no coordinated address, and we really need something like that. So that's my update for this month. I think I've maybe gone on too long again, but there's a lot to say. But what we need to do today, in light of this urgency that the Abraham Accords pose to us, is we need to summon power. We have to go beyond protest, beyond solidarity, and we have to begin to summon power. And like I said, we need to strengthen the ties between the Palestinians here and the international solidarity movement. We have to better articulate what's happening on the ground within the context of the bigger picture and using the analysis and the terminology of settler colonialism. right? In other words, to talk about resistance and not allow them to to cast this as terrorism in criminal types of terms. And we have to bring the normalization process into the center of our actions. We have to create forums for joint political work among all of us and create a space for Palestinians, a protected space, a space where they can come together and begin themselves to formulate the political program that's so much missing today. So that's my update. December 2025. A lot on our plate, an urgency here that we have to deal with. And I'll leave it at that for the time being. Thanks for listening, and I wish you all well. On to 2026. Bye.